This is the King Henry VIII gate of Windsor Castle. For over 800 years, the ancestors of Queen Elizabeth II have lived here. But most of those ancestors were very different sorts of monarch from our present Queen. Our present Queen is a ceremonial monarch. She troops the colour. She rides in processions. She opens hospitals and schools. What she does not do is rule. She has got generals to command her armies. She's got civil servants to run the country. And of course, she does not control the generals or the civil servants. That job is done by the Prime Minister.
I told the House that the Queen had asked me to consider the basis upon which she might voluntarily pay tax on her personal income and also take responsibility for certain payments under the current civil list arrangements. Madam Speaker, I'm confident that the House will welcome these initiatives by the Queen and the Prince of Wales.
The Prime Minister, in theory, is her first servant. Actually, he's the leader of the party that gets the largest majority in a parliament. Earlier monarchs, however, had to be ceremonial monarchs. They also had to be their own prime ministers and sometimes their generals and their civil servants too.
In this series of programs, we're going to travel back in time to the 16th and 17th centuries to meet some of the kings and queens who owned Windsor Castle in the past and who once ruled this country. The Tudors and Stuarts. It is early morning on August the 22nd in the year 1485. Country. The Tudors and Stuarts. It is early morning on August the 22nd in the year 1485. Deep in the Leicestershire countryside, armed men prepare for a battle which will end a war and change the course of English history. For 30 years, the Plantagenets, the royal family of England, had been torn apart in a fierce struggle over which branch of the family should provide the king. Should it be the House of York, whose badge is the white rose? Or should it be the House of Lancaster, whose badge is the red rose? The Wars of the Roses is a family quarrel on a big scale. 10 times the opposing armies of York and Lancaster met in pitched battle. On Bosworth Field, they were to meet for the last time. Leading one army is the Yorkist king, Richard III. On his battle standard flutters his personal badge, the silver boar. Leading the other army, the Lancastrian Duke of Richmond, who believes he should be king. He is a Welshman, and on his flag is the red dragon. His name is Henry Tudor. Today, more than 500 years later, you can visit the battlefield. Flags mark the positions of the armies at the start of the fight. Once a year, around the anniversary, people dress up and reenact the battle close to the spot where it all happened. Reenacting this battle is nothing new. 100 years after the event, William Shakespeare wrote a play about King Richard III, which ends with the Battle of Bosworth.
From their outcloyed country vomits forth to desperate adventures and assured destruction. You, sleeping safe, they bring to you unrest.
In this scene, King Richard encourages his men by describing his rival as a weak and feeble man who will be easy to defeat.
And who doth lead them but a paltry fellow? A milksop! One that never in his life felt so much cold as overshoes in snow.
In the next scene, we find out what Henry thinks about King Richard.
Truly, gentlemen, a bloody tyrant and a homicide.
A base,
foul stone, made precious by the foil of England's chair, where he is falsely set. One that hath ever been God's enemy.
In his play, Shakespeare presents Richard as a man who will do anything to gain power and keep it. He cheats, he lies, he even murders his own young nephews in the Tower of London. Back at Bosworth, the reenactment reaches its climax. From his lookout position on the hill, Richard catches sight of Henry Tudor. This is his chance. If he can kill the upstart rebel, the battle will be as good as over. The plan nearly works. Richard gets within yards of Henry Tudor before he is surrounded and dragged from his horse. Shakespeare's play also reaches its climax. Richard finally meets the man he has been hunting. Henry Tudor, Duke of Richmond.
God in your arms be praised, victorious friends. The day is ours. The bloody dog is dead.
Today, the spot where Richard fell is marked by this stone. Some people believe that Shakespeare didn't describe Richard at all fairly. He was not nearly as evil as the play makes out. Every year, on the anniversary of Richard's death, they put roses by his stone, white roses. In his play, Shakespeare refers to a story in which, after the battle, Richard's crown is found in a thorn bush and brought to Henry Tudor.
Courageous Richmond, well hast thou quit thee. Lo, here this long usurped royalty. Wear it, enjoy it, and make much of it.
Great God of heaven, say amen to all.
The Battle of Bosworth is one of the most famous events in English history, and the date, 1485, is one that we all remember. But we actually know very little about what happened in the battle itself. No TV crews were there, no newspaper reporters, and the contemporary accounts are very poor. So whether Richard III really cried, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, as Shakespeare makes him do, is anybody's guess. What is not a matter of guesswork, however, are the results of the battle. Richard was killed. So were most of the important members of Richard's army. That gave Henry a clean sweep. Even better, not too many important people supported Henry. That meant that he didn't have to reward them. Instead, he was fought for by a close-knit band of supporters that were to be the bedrock of his rule.
This is Westminster Abbey in London. This is where almost every English king and queen has been crowned since William the Conqueror, more than 900 years ago. This is where Queen Elizabeth II was crowned just over 40 years ago. And here, on October the 30th, 1485, Henry VII was crowned King of England, Ireland, and France. Two months later, he was back at the Abbey for his wedding to Elizabeth of York. Thus, the Red Rose of Lancaster was united with the White Rose of York to produce the Tudor Rose, the badge of a new dynasty. This is the museum at Westminster Abbey. It's housed in the Undercroft, one of the oldest parts of the building. Here we can meet King Henry and his bride. Dr. Richard Mortimer, the museum curator, explains.
These heads were made for the funeral effigies of Queen Elizabeth of York and King Henry VII. The effigy is a mock-up of the dead king or queen's body, the same size as the king or queen, and wearing his and her own clothes. The head of Henry VII is made from a death mask, which means that the dead king's face had quantities of wax pressed up against it so that it took an impression of the king's head, just his face and part of his throat and his ears. That was then filled with plaster so that it produced a replica of the king's head. And it's that we have here. We have the front part of his face.
So what sort of country had Henry Tudor conquered? The population was very small compared with today, with less than 3 million people as against 55 million now. London was by far the largest city. 60,000 people lived and worked there. This was the centre of government, business and trade. But most people lived and worked in the countryside, growing crops and raising animals. Much of the land was owned and controlled by great noblemen. Men like the Duke of Buckingham, who lived here at Penshurst in Kent, or the Earl of Oxford, who lived here at Hedingham Castle in Essex. Yet more land was held by the monasteries, like the one at Glastonbury in Somerset. Sheep farming and weaving wool into cloth had made many people very rich indeed. You can see how rich they were because of the wonderful churches they built with their profits. Henry Tudor's England is a very religious Roman Catholic country, but it's also a very wealthy one. Wealthy enough for some men to dream of taking it from him. Henry was well aware he had gained his throne on the battlefield. He could easily lose it the same way. To survive, he needed to do 3 things: to increase his wealth, to reduce the power of the great nobles, and to provide a son to rule after him. Over the next 18 years, Elizabeth gave Henry 8 children in all. 4 died at birth or shortly after. We can plot the ones who survived on a family tree. Arthur, the Prince of Wales, his sister Margaret, Henry, the Duke of York, and his sister Mary. As soon as the children were born, Henry began making plans for their future. The girls would be married to foreign kings to help strengthen Henry's support abroad. Arthur was betrothed to the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. In 1501, when Arthur was 15 and Catherine was just 17, the two were married with great splendor. And what of the 10-year-old Prince Henry, the Duke of York? No marriage plans were made for him, as his father intended he would become the Archbishop of Canterbury. Previous kings had depended on the support of powerful nobles. Henry was determined that this would not happen to him. Together with a group of clever lawyers, Henry began taxing and fining the noblemen. He fined one of his great supporters, the Earl of Oxford, £10,000 for running a private army. The young Duke of Buckingham, who lived at Penshurst Place, was made to pay thousands of pounds for the king's protection. Henry himself checked the accounts each day and signed that they were correct. While many noblemen got poorer and poorer, the king grew increasingly wealthy. And of course, money gives you power. In 1503, a series of tragedies struck King Henry. From Ludlow Castle came news that his eldest son Arthur, the Prince of Wales, had died suddenly. Henry was heartbroken. The following year, his wife Elizabeth also died. She was only 38. Henry grew more and more isolated and lonely. He was suspicious that his courtiers were plotting against him. He trusted nobody. People in turn feared him. His eyesight began to fail.
We think of Henry Tudor as a cold fish, and yet he broke down and cried when his eldest son died. We also think of him as a chartered accountant king who spends all his day with figures, and yet he won a battle and kept the throne as a soldier. But above all, Henry VII was a bit of a gangster. He squeezed money out of people. He ran protection rackets. He kept his bully boys in the localities wearing their livery of green and white, and he eliminated rivals. And that was why he was able to do what no one had been able to do for 100 years and hand his throne over safely to his son, Henry VIII.
The young King Henry set about completing the magnificent new chapel which his father had built on the east end of Westminster Abbey. The chapel would contain his parents' tomb, which would lie close to the tombs of other great kings of England. In his will, Henry VII had left detailed instructions. The tomb would be surrounded by a bronze grille and decorated with the badges of his reign. Dragons, roses, and a crown surrounded by thorns. On the tomb itself, the canvas and plaster effigies would be replaced by bronze figures of himself and his wife. And above him on the walls, carved in stone, angels and archangels, prophets and philosophers, saints and holy men and women, and all the company of heaven. So why did Henry want such an incredible resting place with monks contracted to sing for his soul until the end of time? To glorify his family name and show all the world that even after the king has died, the Tudors live on.
We, Henry, King of England and France, and Lord of Ireland, hereby command and direct that our body be buried in the choir of our college at Windsor, midway between the stalls and the high altar, with the body of our true and loving Queen, Jane.
In a vault beneath this marble slab are deposited the remains of Jane Seymour, Queen of King Henry VIII, and also King Henry VIII himself.
So who was Henry VIII? Was he the handsome 17-year-old boy who ascended the throne? Was he the writer and musician round whom a brilliant court danced? Was he the ruthless and cunning politician who sent even his wives to their deaths? Was he the overweight old man who spent his life in search of fame and glory? Some things about Henry VIII are certain. He ruled for 38 years. He transformed the country and created a legend that has survived to the present day. Each year, thousands of people come to Hampton Court to see Henry's last remaining palace.
My rather beautiful lips. A great gout of flame up into the clear blue sky.
Outside Henry's great hall, performers dressed in Tudor costume entertain the visitors. But what do people know about the life of England's most famous monarch?
That as a young man, he was supposedly very handsome, that he was good friends with Francois Ier, the King of France, that he was into music and dancing and enjoyed having arts and letters at his court.
I should imagine he was a male chauvinist king. He was very aggressive, a drinker.
My lord, I have felt more excitement at the farting of a gnat.
He was the 6th King of England? No, sorry, I don't know very much about Henry VIII.
I now, Richard...
Oh, he lived here.
Fool to His Majesty King Henry VIII, shall blow from the jaws of Hades.
Henry VIII was a king of England. He had 6 wives, and he killed most of them.
Yeah, I don't really think he was a good person though. He was kind of treated his wives a little mean, but yeah, I would like to meet him.
1, 2, 3. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
It is early morning at Hampton Court Palace. The king and most of his courtiers are still asleep. But in the great kitchens, work begins. This man is just one of the 200 servants who work in the palace kitchens. It's his job to light the charcoal stoves, over which all manner of delicate sauces will be cooked. The kitchen is at the heart of every great palace. And of course, King Henry owns 55 palaces. Hunting had always been the sport of kings, and Henry VIII was an enthusiastic hunter. He could wear out 8 or 9 horses in a day, and his poor courtiers who had to ride with him. Henry VIII was only 17 when he came to the throne. But his father had taught him that to be a king, he must live like a king. He must wear magnificent clothes. He must live in magnificent buildings. He must surround himself with a magnificent court and entertain lavishly. This meant offering his courtiers magnificent food. Once a year, the kitchens at Hampton Court Palace are brought to life by a group of reenactors who prepare a meal much as it would have been done 450 years ago.
The court of Henry VIII was quite enormous. There was something like 600 people to be fed every day. And that was in the course of 2 meals. The first one at 10 o'clock was dinner, much earlier than we have it today. And at dinner time, you'd have 300 people sitting down in the hall. As soon as they moved out, another 300 people followed on. So you had to have 600 meals ready in here by 10 o'clock or just after. Then you had to clear the decks and get ready again for supper, which was served at 4 o'clock, because there are only 2 meals in the day at that time. This means that you had to have an enormous amount of kitchen area, and Henry achieved what, even by today's standards, is a very, very well-planned food factory. Food comes in at one of the gates at the front of the palace, and over the top of the gate is a large room with windows at both sides, so the clerks of the green cloth could actually look down into the carts, see all the people and bringing things in. From there are a whole series of rooms with the coal house, for the charcoal, for the stoves. Then there's all the pantries, the larders. Then coming closer to the great kitchen, you had the bakehouses, the sorceries. And now we're in the great kitchen. This is a huge room, mainly for the roasting of meat. So this means that there are a number of huge fireplaces, something like 15 or 18 feet wide. And on the front of these are large iron supports for spits, because the diet here was very largely of roast and boiled meat.
Your Grace!
The amount of food eaten by Henry's court was extraordinary. In 1 year, they consumed the following: 1,240 oxen, 8,200 sheep, 2,330 deer, 760 calves, 1,870 pigs, and 53 wild boars. While Henry spent the day hunting, England was governed by his chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey. In 1520, Wolsey arranged a summit meeting between Henry and Francis, the King of France. Preparations took months. Amongst the busiest members of the royal household were the armourers. They had to make new suits of armour for the king, who was going to take part in a series of tournaments and mock battles. Henry was determined that his armour should be just as splendid as that of the French king. Some of Henry's armour still survives. It's kept in the Tower of London, where it's looked after by the curator, Karen Watts.
All armours are made to measure, so we know this one was made for Henry personally. Henry was 6'2", and when this armour was made, a young man. Very active, very fit. He was a very fine tennis player, very fine dancer and athlete, and he was particularly keen on tournaments. And this armour is for combat on foot. The armour is a magnificent piece of engineering. He could easily run and walk in this armour. It encloses him from head to toe, front and rear. And every single part articulates and moves. Henry would be holding a two-handed sword in this hand, and he needs to be able to move and articulate. The gauntlet rotates on the cuff, and the cuff articulates up to the arm, so he can in fact move the whole arm perfectly easily. Now you've probably noticed this armour has a very large codpiece. This is because all costume and armours of the period had very large codpieces, and this just imitates civilian costume. You could actually remove it with this little pin here if you wanted to go to the toilet.
At last, everything was ready for the journey. Cannons thundered a salute and trumpets blared as Henry, Queen Catherine and Cardinal Wolsey set sail for France. Thousands of courtiers and servants accompanied the expedition. Nothing so splendid had ever been seen before. For 10 days, there was a huge party to celebrate peace between the two countries. Henry took to France a splendid palace made out of wood and canvas in which to entertain the French king. Wine flowed freely from the fountains. The event was so rich and extravagant that it was called the Field of the Cloth of Gold. By night, there were fireworks, and a great dragon burnt across the sky. By day, there were wonderful displays of jousting in which both kings took part. This picture shows Queen Catherine watching from her box as Henry's lance shatters against his opponent's helmet. After the joust, Henry leads a procession back to the palace, where there will be yet another banquet. Despite all their promises of peace and friendship, within 2 years, Francis and Henry were again at war. While the royal kitchens functioned as efficiently as ever, the court was full of rumours. Henry was now gone 30 and had no son to succeed him. His wife Catherine was nearly 40 and past childbearing. Without a male heir, there was a terrible risk that the country would descend into civil war when Henry died. Some men could still remember the Wars of the Roses when the king was weak and mighty noblemen had struggled to win power for themselves. At Henry's court, the struggle for power continued in other ways. Men were not satisfied just to eat the king's meat and drink his wine. They attached themselves to those who had influence with the king. They questioned the loyalty of their rivals. Above all, people did everything they could to win the king's approval. It was a dangerous game they played. It was well known that the king's love